Sultans of Swift. In this lesson, we're going to cover the critically important topic of arrays. We'll learn how to create these ordered lists of information, how to access and manipulate the data inside them, and we'll use our newfound knowledge of arrays to easily add more inspiring messages to our app. Let the big learning begin. Now, I've made a small change to our code from where we left off in the last lesson. I've put some additional code in the app to illustrate an issue we're going to improve on. So I've got 3 constants in here now for 3 different messages, and this if, else statement will cycle through all 3 messages, and we can see in the preview that it works. But if I wanted to add more phrases, I'd have to create new constants, I'd have to add a new else if condition, and if I added several phrases, my code would get longer and longer, 3 lines of code for every additional phrase. Gee, it would be much better if we could make a list of phrases, then just cycle through each phrase in the list. Well, that's what we're going to do, and to achieve that much improved code, we're going to introduce a concept called arrays. First, let's work in the playground where we can experiment with arrays, and then we'll transfer our learning to our app. So go up to File, New, Playground. I'm going to name this Array Playground. I'll resize the window, hide the pane on the left, and delete the greeting. So let's create a variable messages to hold an array of strings. Now we know how to initialize this to a string. We just say equal and then in double quotes, you are awesome. Well, we'd like to put a bunch of strings in messages, and we can do it using a Swift data structure called an array. Now an array is like an ordered list of information, and the elements of that list need to be the same type, but you can create arrays of strings, bools, ints, doubles, and complex data types too. So with an array we have one value, one constant or variable, and inside that there are multiple values of the same type. And we can access any given value by referring to its position in the list. Let's try this. Now the way you create an array in Swift is you enclose the elements inside square brackets. You'll find the square brackets on a US keyboard just above the return key. So I'm going to add square brackets around my string, and this is now an array of strings with only one element. But to add more elements, all I need to do is add them inside of the square brackets, separating each element with a comma. So after the closing double quote and you are awesome, I'll say comma, then the string you are great, and comma, and the string, fabulous, that's you. And now we've got an array with 3 string elements. I can also print the array with print in parentheses messages. Notice code completion knows about messages, and take a look at the type it's listed as down here. Not string, but a string in between square brackets. That means it's an array of strings. So select messages, execute our code with print return. And it prints kind of ugly with brackets and quotes, but I'll show you how we can get around this later. The word fabulous also looks a bit weird because there's a backslash character in front of the single quote. That actually won't print if we print it as a single element or if we use this text inside of our app. Also, let's click on the quick look eye in the results pane just to the right of where we define and initialize our array. And this is cool, it shows all of the elements in the array in a pop-up balloon, so this is a nice way to check the line-by-line status of your executed code. So we printed the entire array. What if we wanted to print just one element of the array? Well, you could just give the name of the array followed by the element number in square brackets like this. Messages, open bracket, 1, close bracket. And by the way, we refer to that number inside of brackets as the index of the element. So shift return to execute the code. And hey, wait, this shows you are great. But I thought this was an ordered list. The first element is you are awesome. Well, Swift, like most computing languages, uses what's called zero indexing. Counting starts at 0, not 1. So if we wanted to get at you are awesome, that's actually in position 0. So we just enter print messages and in brackets 0, shift return. There it is. You are awesome, because now you understand zero indexing. So now let's print out our last element, fabulous, that's you. It's 1, 2, 3, it's the 3rd element in the list. What happens if we say print messages bracket 3 bracket? We get an error, and the error is tough to read, but down here in the console we see this portion that says index out of range. Well, that's because even though there are 3 elements in the array, since we start counting at 0, the last element is 2, not 3, and if we return to 3, we're out of the range. So this is super important to remember. If you refer to an index and there isn't an element at that index, you're going to get an index out of range error, and your code is going to crash. Let's replace the 3 with a 2. Now it works, no errors, and we see the last element. By the way, the version of Xcode that I'm using isn't clearing out all of the error messages, even though my code executed. See this gray text up here? Hopefully your version of Xcode doesn't have this issue, but if it does, you can just click the stop button in the lower left-hand corner just above the console. That'll turn into a play button, then when you click play, it executes again, and it looks like it cleared out the error message. Now, there are a whole host of functions and values that we can access on arrays, and we can get access to them using dot notation. So for example, after we type messages, type dot and take a look at all the stuff we have access to. Now, some of these options have m's next to them. The m stands for method, and a method is a function that operates on a type. And the stuff that shows up here are methods or functions that operate on our messages variable, which is an array of type strings. Most of the methods you see here are functions that would be available to any array. Now, some of these items have a P next to them. P means property. Those are values that we can access that are related to a data type. In our case, these values are related to the string array named messages. So I'd like you to use the arrow keys to find count. Mine shows up at the top since I've used it already. Yours might be listed alphabetically. We see there's a P next to it, so that means it's a property. That means it's going to return a value. Now we see down in code completion it says int, so this will give us an integer back, and code completion says it gives the number of elements in an array. Well, that's handy. Let's try it out. We'll select count. I'll press shift return to execute the code, and we see a 3 show up in the results pane, and that's right, because we've got 3 strings in our string array. I'd like to print out the count in a string that explains what it is, so why don't we try this? Print, and in between parentheses, the string. There are string interp elements in the messages array, and in between the parentheses and the string interp, I'm going to put in messages.count. I'll cut it out from the line above, paste it in between the parens, shift return. Looking good! So here's a mini challenge. Since count returns an int, and ints are used as an index of an array, use count to return the last element in an array. So pause, give it a shot. Let's see how you can do this. Now, some folks might have been tempted to say print and in parentheses messages, bracket messages.count, close brackets. But if we shift return here, oh yeah, we get our index out of range error again because messages.count gives us back the number 3, but the last element in the array is actually 1 minus that. Remember, because of 0 indexing, we start counting at 0. Hey, can you add a little bit of math in between the brackets to get this to give you the right value? Sure you can. Just put a -1 after messages.count, shift return, and this gives us fabulous. That's you, and you are fabulous because you used messages.count to give you the last element in an array. Now, just so you know, there's an array property .last that will calculate and return the last element of any array. And if I write a print statement passing in messages.last, the output looks kind of weird. We see it says optional with fabulous that's you inside the parentheses. This has to do with a Swift concept called optionals, and I'll describe that in a future lesson. We know this exists, but I'll delete it because we're covering it later. Now, what if I wanted to add another phrase to the messages array? Well, let's take a look at code completion and see if it gives us any ideas. Enter messages. And ooh, look, I see an option in here that says append. It might even be the first option in your code completion. So highlight that, and it says adds a new element to the end of the array. That's what we want to do, and it accepts the data type string. But again, if we had an array of doubles or ints, those would also have append methods. You just pass in a double or an int instead of a string. So let's append a new phrase. Select and press return on append. And let's pass in the string, you are fantastic. Then we'll print messages, shift return to execute this, and look at that. We see the array with you are fantastic printed out. Nice. And you can go up here and click on the eye in the quick look, and we can see in line 11, we've got all 4 elements of the array. Up in line 3, we only have 3 elements. Just as expected. Now we can also use the plus operator to add elements to an array, but there's a catch. If I try this, messages equals messages plus, and how about the string, you Swifty? Then shift return, and there's an error. Can you tell what's wrong? Take a look. Binary operator plus cannot be applied to operands of type bracket string and string. We aren't using the same type. Remember, we can't add 2 values that are of different types. Messages is a string array. See string in brackets? While you Swifty is just a single string. But one thing we can do is we can put that single element you Swifty in an array, effectively making it an array of 1. But that's okay, since arrays can have any number of elements, even 0 elements. So with brackets around you Swifty, we're essentially adding a string array to a string array, 2 values of the same type. That's what Swift wants. And I'll print messages below this, shift return. And my version of Xcode should have cleared out the wavy tilde line things that were part of the error. But if I stop button, then press play again, this goes away, and we can see that the end of the array now has a you Swifty. Nice. And no, it's also possible to add not just a single array element, but an array that has multiple elements. So if I add another element to this array, for example, add comma, you are a code monster. Shift return, and we see there are now 2 new elements at the end of the array. Cool. Now that array that we added to messages was a literal 2-element array. And remember, by literal we mean we typed the values in directly, we didn't put them in a variable or constant. But we can also add a variable or constant to messages as long as it's also a string array. So if I create a constant that's also a string array like this, let new messages equals, in brackets, the string, you make me smile, comma, I think you're magic, then I can add these 2 messages like this, messages equals messages plus, and as I type new messages, code completion recognizes that constant that I just created, and note string in square brackets, so this is definitely a string array. So return to accept this, and I'll print messages, and I see the elements from new messages is now part of messages. And we can see all of the elements in the quick look eye too. And by the way, we can also use that cool plus equal notation that we learned about in the earlier lesson. Try this. Comment out messages equal messages plus new messages, and under this write a line that does the same thing, messages plus equals new messages. And by the way, we're getting a lot of print pollution in the console. We're printing lots of stuff. If you ever want to add a blank line between your print output so it's easier to see things, just print an empty string. Each print statement automatically sends a line feed, so printing an empty string will just push the line forward and give you a blank line. So I'll add print empty string just before print messages to add a blank line, but shift return shows the same changes in the array that we saw before. Plus equal works fine. Nice! Now there are a lot more methods we can use with arrays. Let me show you a few of the more common ones. If you wanted to add an element to a specific position in an array, not just append it to the end, we can use the array method insert. Let's try this out with code completion with messages dot, and let's arrow down until we see insert at. There are two possibilities for insert. Choose the one that says new element at, and code completion says inserts a new element into the collection at a specified position. Now what's this collection bit? Well, arrays are part of a set of types in Swift called collections. There are other types in collections too. They include dictionaries and sets, and we're not going to talk about those for a while. But do know that if you're working with arrays and code completion refers to collections, arrays are in fact a collection. Now notice the function takes an element, not an array. See how it just says string in here? An at is an int. That's the position where you're inserting this element into the array, and that'll be its new index value. So let's go ahead and use this. Press return, and why don't we insert the string you are skilled? And then we need to indicate where we want to insert it at. Let's insert it as the second element of the array. So what number do we need to pass in to make that happen? A 1. Remember, we're 0 index, so the second element is a 1. So now let's print out the array. I'll just copy the two print statements from up here and paste them below. Shift return. And we see you are skilled as the second element in the array. Nice! Now another thing you might want to do is to delete a value from the array, and to do that you use the .remove method. So I'll give my space a little bit more room so you can read my code completion, but if you type messages.rem, and wow, there are a lot of remove methods. And they're all pretty self-explanatory. Remove at, remove all, remove first, remove last. You can explore these on your own if you want, but let's say we wanted to remove the value we just added. We could select remove at, so why don't you highlight that in code completion, and let's take a look. Now there's an arrow after remove at, and the arrow points to string. And the description in code completion says removes and returns the element at the specified position. So the arrow string means this function will actually give you the string that's removed. So the append function and the insert function modified the array, but they didn't return a value. But the arrow string here means this function is actually going to give you back a string, an element of the array, specifically the one that it removes, and we can take that result and we can assign it to a variable or a constant. So let's imagine we want to remove the second message from the array and put that value in a new constant named removed value. Well, I'll press return to accept this method, and if I want to remove the second element in my array, I'm going to pass in a 1. Remember, we're 0 indexed. And remove is not only going to remove the element from the array, it's going to return that element so we can do something with it. So we can say in front of this, let removed value equals messages.remove at 1. Then I'll print an empty string to give myself a line feed, and I'll say print, and in parentheses, I'll enter removed value, so that's just the string that I removed, comma, messages, that should print out the whole array with that one element removed. Shift return, and look at that. Removed value is you are skilled, and now we see the array no longer has you are skilled in it. Cool. Now, one more thing you might want to know is how to create an empty array. Now, sometimes you want to create an array that holds values, but at first you don't have any values for the array since they might all be entered by your app's user. So let's imagine, for example, that we want to create an empty array of doubles that will hold a student's grades. Well, we can enter something like this, var grades equals open and close bracket, because Swift doesn't know what should go inside this array. Now, normally we implicitly declare the type by passing in a value, but empty brackets are the right notation for an empty array, but since there's nothing inside the array, Swift is clueless what should go inside here. And we can see once we've done this, we get an error, empty collection literal requires an explicit type. So we need to explicitly declare the type of the array, and we do it like this. Var grades colon, so you put a colon after the variable or constant name, and then in brackets we'll say double because this is an array of type double, and that can be equal to an empty string. The error goes away, and we can add values by inserting them like this, grades.append in parentheses 82, or we could add multiple grades at once, grades plus equals in brackets 87, 91. We can print these out. I'll give a line feed with print empty string, then print grades. Shift-Enter pushed my code up a bit, but take a look at what prints out down below. Now, even though I defined this array as a double, I passed in numbers without decimals. Swift knew automatically to convert those to doubles, and that's why we see when we print out an array of doubles, each of these has a 0.0 after it. And remember, if you want to clear these values out, we could say grades equals open and close bracket with nothing inside. And since grades has already been declared as an empty string, totally fine to do this. We don't need to refer to this as a doubles array. And if we try to get a count of the grades array now, print grades.count, we get a 0. And we can also print grades, and we see just empty brackets with nothing inside. And one last thing on arrays, there are a couple formats for declaring empty arrays. Now, the one that I've used up here is preferred by Apple, but you might sometimes see notation that looks like this. I'll comment out the first declaration, and then below that I'll write var grades equals, in brackets, double, open and close parent. So this code on the right-hand side of the equal sign both declares the array as an array of doubles and initializes it to an empty array. I suggest you use this notation up here, but do know the other notation is the same thing, just in case you see it in somebody else's code. Now, there's a lot more to arrays than we've just showed, but now you possess a solid basic knowledge of Swift arrays, and more important, you know enough for a challenge. So this is the array challenge. Modify your project code so that it now uses a string array named messages. Add several inspiring phrases of your choice to messages. Make sure you include at least 4. The first time your app runs, the text view should be blank, but pressing the show message button should cycle through the messages, 1 message for each press, advancing to the next message. So I've got 4 messages here. You are awesome. You are great. You are fantastic. Fabulous. That's you. When the final message in the list is shown, then the next button press should return you back to that first message. That's why I start again at you are awesome. And bonus, write your code so that it works unmodified even if you add or remove elements from the messages array. So if I later go in and add 2 new elements to messages, I shouldn't have to make any more changes in my code for this to work and cycle through all the messages. So pause. You can do it. And after you've given it your best shot, let's resume and compare answers. So let's start in the button action, and I'm going to delete all of the old message code, but I'll keep my image code down here. And now let's first write our messages array. Now it can be a constant since we're not changing messages during the execution of our app. So we'll say let messages equals open bracket, quote, you are awesome, close quote, comma, and I'm going to press return. Now watch what happens. I'm going to start entering values on separate lines. So I'll write you are great, comma, return, you are fantastic, comma, return, and fabulous, that's you. And here's a formatting tip. So I'm going to highlight all 4 lines in my message array. And remember the keyboard shortcut to fix indenting? It's Control-I. So I'm going to enter that here, and it formats all the elements in the array so they line up. Now you can still write all elements in the array on a single line, and this technique that I just showed you takes up more space, but most folks think this is neater and a better choice since it's easier to read the values in your code. Now I didn't show you this in Playgrounds because for some reason Playgrounds doesn't yet support this kind of formatting. Now we want to keep track of which element in our messages array to show, and we want to start with element 0. So just like we needed a state variable for image number, we want to create a value to keep track of which message we're showing too. So why don't we head up top and add @state private var, and we'll call this message number and set it equal to 0. Now our text view is already set to the empty string when it starts, so that's okay. Then down in our button code, we'll set message string equals messages, and in brackets, message number. Then the code we do after this is almost identical to what we did with our images. We're going to add 1 to message number, so we can say message number equals message number plus 1, or we could just say message number plus equals 1. Then we'll check to see if message number equals 4, because if we hit 4, then we're past the end of our array. Remember, we're 0 indexed. We've got 4 elements. They're numbered 0, 1, 2, 3. So we'll open and close brackets, and if this is true, we'll set message number equal to 0. Now this is going to work, but for our bonus, we can do even better. Instead of putting the literal value 4 in here, we can change that to messages.count. So if we go back and change the number of messages in our array, we don't have to go in here and change that old value 4. It's going to calculate when we need to reset back to 0 based on the length of the array. Nice. So now let's go ahead and run our code. We've got all 4 messages in here. And when we've seen that last message, we cycle back to the first one. Works great. But now we can go back and add a couple of phrases. How about, you make me smile, and when the genius bar needs help, they call you. I'll highlight these in Control-I so that I fix my array formatting. And then let's try this again in the preview, go through them all, and this works great. So .count here is a much better coding technique. Your coding skills are getting super strong, Swifter, and in this lesson we had an array of big learning. We learned to declare and initialize arrays with values and as empty arrays. We now know about zero indexing. We printed arrays. We printed and accessed individual array elements using an index. We used print empty string to add a blank line to console output. We learned about methods and properties. We used the array.count property. We committed the index out of range error and now understand why it happens, as well as how we might think about fixing that error. We learned to add elements to an array using the append method, the plus operator, and the insert method. And we learned how to remove elements from an array. Your Swift and app building skills are accruing. Feel good about what you've accomplished and keep at it.